Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out my channel. Today, I'm going to talk about a review. I don't know, not review. It's not like I'm giving out star ratings. I'm going to talk about Scout's Honor, which is a Netflix documentary that I just sat down to watch the other day. I think it has a lot of overlap with one of my specialties, which is dealing with religious trauma. Not just because the Scouts had a lot of ties to different religious organizations, but I think it has a lot to do with how abuse can be perpetrated in these spaces and how these organizations cover them up. So it's definitely something that was like up my alley. I wanted to talk about some things that popped up in the documentary. Um, the documentary, I think, was well done. I don't know. I'm not like a huge documentary person. It had a whistleblower by the name of Michael Johnson, not the Michael Johnson who used to wear gold cleats in the Olympics. For all you millennials who care about those things. But Michael Johnson was a former police officer, and he worked with child abuse cases. And so the Boy Scouts of America hired him to bring him in to try and get some different like policies and procedures in place to make sure they're protecting kids. And he worked for the Boy Scouts, and the documentary interviews him pretty heavily and kind of into what was going on in the Boy Scouts. And then there's a journalist who wrote a book called Scout's Honor. So same with the documentary. Takes its name from that chronicled the abuse cases, the secret files of the Boy Scouts of America. So those are kind of the two main characters. There's somebody, a lawyer who worked for the Boy Scouts, or up until recently was working for the Boy Scouts of America. He was kind of the counterpoint. He was maybe like the pro voice of the Boy Scouts. Not a good look. And again, like some of that gets edited and whatever. I wouldn't send my boy to Scouts. Neither of my children are in Boy Scouts. That's the recommendation, as based by my evidence. But no, it's one of those things where it's really unfortunate. I think something like over 82,000 victims came forward when the Boy Scouts filed for bankruptcy as a way to get out of paying for more additional lawsuits. That kind of they filed Chapter 11, and the documentary just breezes past a lot of this. So the Catholic Church does this too, where they will have a diocese, a geographic location of church groups that will file for bankruptcy, but the church itself, the big Catholic C, the capital C Catholic Church, won't be on the hook for any of those damages. So it's a way that these huge organizations that have millions and billions of dollars, I don't know if the Boy Scouts have billions of dollars, but the churches definitely do, that they avoid this abuse. And what happens is perpetrators, predators find groups like this that have very low accountability, and they're able to abuse children. They get access to children easily. They abuse children. And if they happen to get caught, the organization covers it up because the organization doesn't want to look bad. The person goes on their merry way. They move across the country. They go to a different troop or town, or in the case of pastors, I've seen this over and over and over again. Catholic priests, Southern Baptist Church. I've seen it in my own life for pastors who weren't abusing people, but were doing other unethical things, that they just get shuffled elsewhere because the organization, Boy Scouts of America, Mormon Church, Catholic Church, they don't want to look bad in the public eye. And so they just cover it up. And so perpetrator or predator wants that lack of accountability because they know they can get away with it. Should they get caught, there's a high level of them talking their way out of it and getting away with it, and just moving to go on and abuse other people. So one of the perpetrators in the documentary abused over like 300 kids. And again, like, this is something the Boy Scouts of America knew about. They knew he was sexually assaulting children. He was raping children. Like, sexual abuse as like a thing we say in the parlance of our time has become almost like it's bad. It's still one of like the worst crimes, especially if it's kids. But like, again, here's somebody who was a deacon in their church, who was a scout leader, who was raping children, and then the Boy Scouts covered it up because they didn't want to look bad. So then he went from town to town to town across the country, raping children. And like, that's horrific. And we should talk about it as if it is horrific, because the bad guys in this story are not just the perpetrator, definitely bad guy, but also that the Boy Scouts of America knew about this, didn't do anything about it because they did not want to look bad. And so the documentary was really interesting because the journalist who really looked into this, who got access to the secret files, the Boy Scouts called them the perversion files. He goes back into like the 70s and 80s. So again, this is like big oil knowing that global warming was a problem and not doing anything about it. Like the Boy Scouts of America have known since at least the 70s that this is a problem. They were attracting too many perpetrators because they had no accountability. Rather than introduce accountability, they like started hating gay people. I don't know. That might have been tied into the Mormon Church, but again, it's one of those things where accountability in these groups, in churches, in organized religion, in scout groups, any sort of social group that doesn't have a formal process for accountability, whether it's people losing jobs, not having mandated reporters on staff, not having a confidential way to report things. These are all ways where we can make it more likely that victims will come forward. And if those things aren't there, then what we're attracting is perpetrators. Like if you don't have any safeguards, if you have no accountability, and churches almost never do, because churches, organized religion has it in mind that like God will judge people. If you're a perpetrator, you're not worried about your eternal well-being. You probably maybe you don't believe in God. You're not following the morals and ethics of your doctrinal teachings. Okay, like roll the dice on that. Like if you're gonna try and abuse children and that's what you get off on, then that eternal damnation thing maybe isn't a huge scary tactic. So again, like it's disingenuous for churches to act like that's any sort of real accountability. It's not, and it's definitely not for the victims who are dealing with the here and now of being abused. And then to say like God will judge is really gross. That's not accountability. That's passing the buck, literally passing the buck, so that you can keep passing your collection plate and collecting people's money. I don't have nice things to say about organized religion. And again, it's not just like, oh, Jeremy, you left religion and so you're salty about it. It's like, no, these are known issues. These are things that if the church cared about, if the Boy Scouts of America cared about it, if, I threw out big oil earlier, like if these groups actually cared, which they don't, but if they did, they would do different behaviors. And because their actions aren't changing, it shows that they don't actually care. They care about public perception. They care about keeping people in their doors. They care about their social status. They do not care about victims at all. And so they're fighting in court to not pay victims. They're fighting in court to not take care of people, not be accountable for people, and to not have to change their ways, right? Like they will spend millions of dollars on lobbying and trying to get politicians to make sure that they have a protected place. So Boy Scouts of America, and the reason I'm bringing up religion so much is because the documentary kind of glosses over this too, but the Boy Scouts of America really set up their structure similar to what the Catholic Church used. So like that aged poorly. So like something, the sex scandal comes out with the church, the Catholic Church, they've been covering up all this abuse for all these years and moving perpetrators from town to town to town instead of doing anything about it. That same structure then exists in the Boy Scouts of America and in Mormonism. So the Mormon Church was at one point sending all their kids, well, all their boys, I guess, because patriarchy. All the boys had to go through Scouts, and so the Mormon Church was a really big deal for Boy Scouts leading up to some of this stuff, and that's where the hating the gays really came in, because the Mormon Church was saying like, oh, it's not that pedophile, it's not that perpetrators are the problem, it's not that abuse is the problem, it's that there are too many gay scout leaders, and that's why they're abusing boys, because only gay people abuse boys. And that's not true. Like statistically we know that's not true. Many like more than half of the people who males who sexually assault boys report being straight. Like it's not about being homosexual, it's not about sexuality at all. It's generally about power. It's about that hierarchical structure, which is there in all these organizations. Like that hierarchy creates problems. That's why abuse happens when you don't have proper accountability in place. That cliche, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like it's not about that. It sort of is about that. That's an oversimplification. It's about there not being accountability in place so that people who want to abuse the power structure can get into the power structure and then do the abuse that they want to do. So definitely a problematic thing. 82,000 is low. Like that's the sad part in this is the documentary makes a big deal, like what a huge number. And then we also know like unequivocally that number is low. Not every perpetrator has had the opportunity to come forward. Not every perpetrator has healed enough to come forward, because again, it's not just like I was abused, so now I come forward. There's power dynamics at play. So it's hard to speak out against your abuser. Abusers are telling kids, like, no one will believe you. So one of the things the documentary probably could have done more of, but I don't know, legal reasons or whatever, didn't have a ton of victims. But the victims that it did have on, their stories are very hard to listen to. It's very uncomfortable. And hearing, like, scout leaders are flying in from other countries to come and rape them, and like, it it's horrific is what it is. And so again, it's one of those things where we need to listen to victims, we need to listen to people who are speaking out against it, we need to have systems in place to support them, and there needs to be actual accountability. So like the Boy Scouts of America trying to get out of pain for these things. Oh, we know that number's wrong. Sorry, I was talking myself in a circle here. We know that number is low, 82,000 plus, because as the documentary highlights, like, some of the people who were also abused, some of these scouts who were speaking up in the documentary, former scouts who were abused, are saying, I lost my friends because they killed themselves, or they drank themselves to death, or they overdosed, because that's how people are trying to numb their their trauma. They're trying to ignore or not feel what they were made to feel. And like, some of the depictions are really graphic, because like, this is a graphic thing, this is a horrific thing, this takes somebody's childhood away, this derails the course of their life, and will take years to heal from their trauma. And oftentimes that's not happening until much later in their development. So the brain kind of shuts down and goes into survival mode. Development and maturation is stunted. Is maturation the right word? Maturing. Um, and so it comes up later in life, where like, when you're in your 20s and your brain's done growing, and you realize, like, that wasn't okay. I've been in relationships now, I've seen what healthy health looks like, I've seen what love and support looks like, that wasn't it. And so it takes years. And so like, having these, deadlines, they talk about this in the documentary too, like having a statute of limitations on child abuse doesn't make any sense, because most people aren't in a developmental state where they can even come forward until later in their life, because the the fact that they were abused stunts their development. And therefore, protecting abusers by having a statute of limitations and saying you need to come forward after X number of years, when that isn't developmentally appropriate, and then their development is stunted, like, that's helping perpetrators get away with it. And if you think, like, the legal system and the political parties at play are not designed to protect perpetrators, like, I don't know, watch more documentaries like this. Like, they are. It's why we have so many pedophiles in politics, like, heavily on the right wing side. If that's offensive, go on the internet and Google it. There's a long list that is out there of all the GOP operatives who have been pedophiles. So again, like, the scouts, the church, all these things are attracted to that lack of accountability, and they're coming in and they're getting away with it. And then they're using tactics, because it's not just about sex, it's about power hierarchies and power differentials. They're saying things like, no one will believe you. And if you're, it's the 1970s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, really anything before the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal came out. If somebody's a deacon in their church, which a lot of these people were, they're standing up on Sundays as ushers. They're big people in the community. They're scout leaders. They're well thought of. And you're a teen or you're a child, and you're saying this person raped me. Like, you're embarrassed because of the homophobia of culture at that time. You're fearful of being injured or hurt again. You're fearful that no one will believe you. So then you're risking your own social standing to just get ostracized or treated poorly again. Some of these people, almost all the victims in the documentary, not all victims overall, but all the victims of the documentary reported coming from single parent homes, which again, in the 70s, 80s was much less common and probably less supported. So then you're having somebody who's like coming into your house because they're with the church or they're with scouts, and then that's creating havoc. Like, that's a trusted person coming to your house, and that's your abuser. Like, that's not a healthy setup. One of the other things that I think the documentary could have maybe gone into a little bit further was like how trauma then impacts people. Like, I think it's overly simplistic to just say like, oh, well, and then I was traumatized. There's, the victims that were in the documentary all talk about like, my childhood was ripped away from me, or like, was never able to recover. how many years it took them to speak out about it, how many people had substance use issues or anger problems or problems in their relationships. Like, these are the things that linger. And I think it's one of those things where, like, we need to talk more openly about trauma, not just intellectually, as a concept or a theory, but like how it affects people, the myriad of ways that it affects people. There are ways where it affects everybody similarly, in that our body holds on to it. Our trauma is a response to a negative impact or a negative event in our life. So we call them adverse events. And so it's one of those things where, like, when your brain thinks it's in survival mode or is actively in survival mode, when your brain has to face its own mortality, there is a significant threat, then your brain is going to have this trauma response. It goes into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And if you're not able to get to a place of safety, let's say you can't go tell a parent, or you tell a parent and they don't believe you, or worse, that parent also abuses you. If you're not allowed to complete the stress cycle, you're not able to go through threat, back to safety, now I feel safe, then you're dealing with trauma. Trauma is what happens after. It's what holds it in your brain and holds it in your body. And so a lot of these things are physical then, where they're trying to numb those experiences, or they're constantly in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, those trauma responses. That's what being triggered used to mean. Like, that's where that phrase comes from, is a trauma response. It's kind of been co-opted to mean anything that bothers you when we talk about the social sciences. But it's really about that trauma response, that fight or flight, freeze or fawn. And we want to get out of that, and it takes work to get out of that. And again, so that's where, like, the bureaucracy around some of this has protected abusers for a long time, has protected perpetrators, because the development that's needed, and the stage in life to get to where you can feel safe and you can process some of this intellectually, and then rewire your brain so that your brain and your body can process it together, because trauma is held in your body, not just your brain, then this takes years and years and years. And not like it needs to be years and years of therapy, although I will say a trauma history is one of those X factors that in how long therapy might take. But it's one of those things where it's really just tipping the scales to defend perpetrators. So that's really gross. The juxtaposition of Michael Johnson, who is the former police officer who was hired to work for the Boy Scouts and put in policies and procedures, versus the lawyer for the Boy Scouts, very obvious. The documentary, I'm sure, edited that to be dramatic, but, like, they're not on the same page, even though they worked together for many years and ran in the same circles, being in the upper echelon of the Boy Scouts of America. One of them was like, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. I can't work here anymore because everyone's ignoring that this is a problem. The other one's like, no, this is not a problem. Like, Boy Scouts are safe. Like, you could just hear, like, the corporate messaging behind it still from the lawyer. And again, like, it's one of those things where, like, it's not safe. There has not been enough implemented. The Boy Scouts had a lot of pushback after their bigotry against gay people came out. And then when they were like, okay, we're going to stop hating gay people and being bigots, then the Mormon church left them. So again, like, it's capitalism is not the root cause, but this makes it muddier. Like, capitalism in the sense of doing things for profit, like the fact that we have to make money off of these things. We have to have a system where we're reliant on volunteers, otherwise we don't make enough money. Instead of paying people, we're reliant on volunteers instead of having good safeguards in place. Like, that's where we're coming in. You're not going to run background checks on people who are going to be around kids. Like, that's so irresponsible. And again, like, some of this we view differently after the Catholic Church sex scandal came out. But, like, again, how many years was it then where the Southern Baptist Convention's abuse came out? And, like, who's doing this for every organized religion? Who's doing this for every group that has access to children? Like, there are background checks for your kids' teachers. There are background checks for your kids' coaches, for the most part, if they're a part of an affiliated group that does background checks. Like, this is good information to find out and look into, like, who's around my kids and who has access to them. What are the safeguards in place to keep my kids safe? Volunteer things like Sunday school teachers or day camp people, like, they may or may not be safe for your kids to be around. So doing the legwork to make sure that, hey, we need to have background checks. We need to make sure there's no federal record. And the other thing is, like, supporting victims. So when people come forward and say that they've been abused, we have to work with them. We have to believe them and try and support them, because it's one of those things where if people come forward against somebody and nothing happens, well, then it doesn't show up on their background check. So, like, I know of someone in the volleyball world where I coach, and spent many years coaching, who was a known abuser, who was inappropriate with minors over and over and over again, maybe never rising to the level of assault, but like definitely abuse and harassment. And nobody ever pressed charges against this person. Like nothing ever happened. So even though when like it was brought up and people talked to me about it, because I'm a therapist, I work in this world of reporting and mandated reporting, etc. I remember I was at a coach's training thing, and I stood up and talks about how you can make an anonymous report to CPS, and like in this big like ballroom where all these coaches are going through this mandatory training, and like the speakers just like turned white and like totally unprepared to talk about something like child abuse, even though the agency was running background checks and had doing some due diligence. Like again, it's just one of those things where people who don't work with this don't know how to talk about it, don't know how to deal with it. So it's one of those things where like people would come and talk to me about it and would say like, well, right, like I would never have a kid play for that person. I would never send a kid to that club. Like it's way too risky. We know this. The agency, the big club knew this, and also couldn't do anything because nobody pressed charges. I will say the club didn't work very hard, or not the club, never a club that I was at. I wouldn't have worked with this person. But the region, the big geographic location that supports all these different clubs, again, had some good safeguards in place, but also wasn't going out of the way to say, anybody have a bad experience with this person? Here's a hotline. Or, like, again, it's that same, like, we don't want the bad rap. We don't want the reputation. We want to be able to say just a few bad apples, which, like, when people use that idiom, like the phrase is a few bad apples spoil a whole bunch. So if you're going to say, oh, it was only a few rogue actors, only a few scouts who were abusing people, like, well, 82,000 victims would beg to differ. And like, it's only a few people, that spoils a whole bunch. Like that's the phrase there. That's the common knowledge. That's the normal idea of like, right, if you have a few, that's too many, that's going to ruin everything. So these places should be sued into oblivion. The church, organized religion, Boy Scouts of America. Like again, if you're not going to invest in the infrastructure, you're not going to put the safeguards in place to protect victims, you're not going to put in the safeguards to weed out abusers. Both those things happen simultaneously to hopefully minimize it and probably not get rid of it. And then we have to have a way where we're supporting and we're believing victims when they come forward. Like, what was it, Danny Masterson? This is unrelated to the Netflix documentary, but like Ashton Kutcher worked for a nonprofit that helped to stop child sex slavery. And like when his friend was accused of sexually assaulting people, he spoke in defense of his friend. Like there's such cognitive dissonance to be like, this is a good person. Like it didn't happen to me, so it can't happen. Like that's what gets in the way of believing victims when they come forward. Is just because this person is nice to you or helpful to you doesn't mean they're not a predator. Most predators acknowledge the power hierarchies around them. They see those things clearly so that they can take advantage of them. So if you have a lot of power, of course they're going to be kind to you. Of course they're going to befriend you. Of course they're going to be helpful to you, because then you're going to come to their defense. So it's one of those things where like, for people who are manipulating the system, like we need to make the system harder to manipulate. We need to have these safeguards for our own human cognitive biases so that we're not defending people who are doing horrific things to women or children or people of color. Any marginalized group is at risk for being abused in this way. So we need to be better about, as a society, we need to be better about listening to victims when they come forward and having ways to support them. It's not about getting rich. It's about like, you're going to spend money to fight court cases. You're going to spend money for lawyers, for PR firms, for all these things when you could be supporting victims. So it's just, it's a whole paradigm shift. I think some of it is capitalism. I think some of it's bureaucracy. I think a lot of it is patriarchy and those hierarchical social setups where abusers are seeing these things as easy ways. There's low accountability. There's high level of access to children or other marginalized groups that's going to attract a predator, like a moth to a flame. So it's one of those things where we need to be a lot better about that. These places that have high levels of risk need to be better at saying there's risk and here's the safeguards we're putting into place. Like churches are awful. Like you're not going to do a background check on a pastor. You're not going to do a background check on a Sunday school person because they're a volunteer. They're not an employee. And like that person then has access to kids. Like it needs to be better than that. So I guess a little bit to defend Boy Scouts, which again, my kids aren't going to Boy Scouts, so that's where I stand on that. But like, they have added some safeguards. They have done some of these things, but the whistleblower Michael Johnson came forward in the first place because he said they were not doing enough. What little bit they were doing was not enough to keep kids safe, and he basically came out and said Boy Scouts is still unsafe. So I don't know. I don't know that I would call it a fascinating watch. I think it's a good thing to watch. I think if people are very up in arms about their religious beliefs or their organized religion, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there. They're still kind of in that cult mindset. Um, then I think there's a documentary about something like Boy Scouts highlights all those ways in which authoritarian control, hierarchy, patriarchy, where these things are allowed to exist, and that creates an environment where abuse is likely to happen. So I think it's a good way to kind of look outside the lens of religion. I'm a religious trauma specialist, so I see all the ways in which religion does this too, because Boy Scouts took the Catholic model and applied it to their structure. So a lot of overlap there. If you're curious about this or want to learn more about it or look at it from a different lens, I think the documentary presents that in a good way. Again, they could have gotten into like the BITE model, Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which is behavior, information. The BITE stands for behavior, information, thought, emotion control. Ways in which cults or other authoritarian groups, which is like the Boy Scouts, lots of rules, lots of power imbalances, lots of structures that put people in charge of other people. That's what authoritarian really means. So yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, I think it's an interesting lens. It's a way to step outside of maybe some triggering stuff or some cognitive dissonance around religion and look at like how does an organization get set up like this, where they put organization before the lives or the health of children. And like, again, the church is definitely guilty of that. How many go to any private school sports program and they'll have some short shirt, or somewhere in the past couple of years, they'll have some sort of like God family team or God team, whatever, like some mantra around like the church, the entity, the belief system is more important than the individual. And that is ripe for abuse then, because the people are going to protect the organization over listening to the individuals. And that's how abuse gets perpetrated. So Scouts Honor. I liked it, but again, you know, I work with this stuff. I liked it in a sense of like it humanized some of the experience of taking it out of this theoretical concept of like, oh, church abuse or sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts. And when we hear from the victims, I think that really hammers home like how horrific this stuff is. I think having somebody who worked in the Boy Scouts and then was the whistleblower, I think goes a long way. So I thought the documentary was helpful in that way. It's not like fun to watch. I don't give it like, you know, 2 thumbs up and say like, commit your weekend, do it. Like it's distressing, but I think it's good. It's good to have these things. It's good to share these things with people who might otherwise not be able to see the authoritarian control model and the abuse system that is prevalent in these different organizational groups that follow this same model. So if we want to protect victims, we want to protect kids, we shouldn't be banning books. We should be holding organizations accountable where abuse has happened historically and continues to happen to this day because they're not making the changes they need to. So yeah, check out Scouts Honor, share it, comment on it. If there's other things that you would like me, a mental health professional, I have specialties in relationships, licensed marriage and family therapist. I have specialties in religious trauma, and I have specialties in sports performance. So if any of that stuff sounds interesting, you want me to check something out, I like to review songs or shows or movies, and I like to interact with people. So like, subscribe, drop down in the comments and give me ideas if you got something you want me to check out. Otherwise, everybody take care. Peace.